Hello, welcome to another Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig Lyndall, joined as always by Andrew Schnitkey. We've got a website, thealbumofrecord.com. Albumofrecord.com. It's not thealbumofrecord.com, it's albumofrecord.com. We are on all the streaming platforms for our podcast and on YouTube. This episode is one that if you are ever going to watch on YouTube, you might want to do so. We are going to use album covers and whatnot. We are talking about the best music of 2024. It's been a good year. How's it going, Andrew?
It is going pretty good, Craig. I still dealing with the aftermath of this death cold virus. It's all out of my sinuses, but I've still got the lingering cough phase, and so my throat gets a little scratchy when I talk too much. But thankfully, I don't have to do any talking today. But it's all good. Like I said last week, I'll power through it because I'm super excited for this. You know how I feel about making end of year lists, reading end of year lists. I am such a sucker for it. I love it. I treat it like it's a science, not an art. And so I'm just really excited to talk about our favorite music from this year, which was an absolutely ridiculously loaded year for music.
It really was. And I think that it was a loaded year for music across the board, not just for you and me and people in our wheelhouse in terms of music. I feel like pop fans were blown away this year by Brat Summer and Taylor Swift and Sabrina Carpenter.
Yeah.
So yes, it's really cool for us with a lot of the weird and post-rock and hardcore and indie and whatever you want to call the music that we listen to. But I feel like just in general, the world at large felt very good about music in 2024.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think you see that reflected in a lot of the year-end lists, except for Pitchfork, which I never understand their lists, but I really didn't understand their list this year. It was, I don't know. They picked these albums that like I haven't heard them talk about much all year, and all of a sudden it shows up at the top of their list, but I'll digress on that. I just think
we'll talk about that again when I get to my number 2 for the year, because I found the comments very interesting on another podcast.
So yeah, but in general, I think, listening to other podcasts, reading other lists, I think a lot of people have made similar comments that this was an absolutely loaded year. I told you I never have struggled so much with my top 5 as I did this year. There's so many albums that would be easy top 5 albums in other years that couldn't make it. I really wrestled with my number 6 album that didn't make my top 5. I'm still struggling with it. My favorite album for 60% of the year ended up number 7 on my list because just so much other good music came out later in the year, and it was just a loaded year.
All right, so let's not bury the lead then. First of all, don't leave them hanging. What was number 6 and what was number 7 for you?
Yeah, so number 7 was the Meat Bodies album. That it was truly my number 1 album for the majority of this year. I thought for sure at one point that this was going to be my favorite album of the year. The only album that I think ended up ahead of it that that was already out before it was Pearl Jam, which we'll get to. And the reason for me flipping that I can talk about later. But it was just, so many albums came out like later in the year that surpassed it. And then number 6 for me was the Vampire Weekend album, which, God, I love that album. Beginning to end, it was such a not only is it a return to form album in a way for them, it was an album that sort of touched on every era. Like you could hear elements of every era that they did in this. And it was like just this career spanning retrospective type album. It was so well done, well crafted. I love everything about it. And it kills me that this is not a top 5 album because it deserves it for me. But, there's just 5 albums I liked more. I had to be honest about it.
Which brings us to number 5, and it's going to spawn a longer conversation because you and I talked about ahead of time, did we coordinate our lists? Not really, but a little bit. We've been talking all year long. We've been talking on this podcast all year long. We talk all the time about music. So it's kind of no wonder that our lists are not all that shockingly similar. So number 5 for us this year is Dark Matter by Pearl Jam. It was easy for me to put it in the top 5 just based on nostalgia, how much I listened to it, how much I loved it, how much I loved hearing a lot of these songs live this summer. And you called a Vampire Weekend a return to form. This might be the ultimate return to form record for the year. But you were a little bit concerned, or you wondered if maybe you were selling out and it shouldn't have been higher.
Yeah, as I had put together my list, I said that I had it locked, and then I went back and was listening one last time to my top 5, to just reinforce it. And as I was listening to Dark Matter, I was listening to it with headphones too, which this album just sounds so good on headphones. And I was just listening to all the different parts, and I was like transported back to all the way back in, God, I don't even remember what month it was when I went to the movie theater for the premiere event where I got to listen to the album twice, a couple days before it actually came out. And I was just thinking about that first time listening when they didn't have any lights on in the theater. There was nothing on the screen. They just played the album. And I was just reclined back in my comfy movie theater seat and just being just like in awe, just shocked at how good that album was. And so many times listening to that, and I was like really taken back to that moment. And it made me wonder for a second. I'm like, is this really my second favorite album of the year? My number one is absolutely unimpeachable. Nothing could have knocked that one off. But this Pearl Jam album, it's hard to separate like my feelings as a Pearl Jam fan versus an objective view of it, I guess. But again, just listening to it, there's so many things that I hear in this that just feel like Pearl Jam, like that quintessential Pearl Jam sound that I felt had been missing over the last, couple of albums. And they just delivered exactly what I would want in a late era Pearl Jam album. So a part of me feels like it should be higher, but I really had to be sort of honest and separate the emotional aspect of, feeling that nostalgia, like you said, for this sounding a little bit like reminding me, if you will, of earlier era Pearl Jam.
Yeah, for me, I'm with you. If it was popularity and the amount I listened to any record, it would absolutely be number one by a long shot, just because I was so obsessed with it and it never quite completely left my listening habits, all from the moment the singles came out to the moment where I was listening to the full record. At the same time, if I'm being brutally honest, and I love this record, I will forever love this record. It doesn't redefine the band. It doesn't push the ball forward. If anything, it's a nostalgic callback. It's fan service, and I'm here for it. I'm happy about it. But and we're not critics, we're fans first. But if I'm being intellectually honest, I just felt like I was doing it justice by putting it in the top 5. I was giving justice to my nostalgia and my love and my heart for Pearl Jam by putting it in the top 5 at all, because you're not going to find this album in many top year-end lists, and that doesn't diminish how much Pearl Jam fans love this record or how much anybody should love this record. It just goes to show that they've already been defined. They've defined themselves in any number of ways. This album doesn't further define them as much as it just allows them to add a few songs to the set list on a going forward basis.
Yeah, I think that's all pretty valid, and I think that's why it ended where it did. And, there's just, I personally feel like all of the 4 albums I ranked ahead of this all did those things you talked about. They, in some way, pushed the bands forward in a way that, this one maybe didn't. So, it's hard when you do these lists. Again, everything is subjective, but, you have to sort of set aside sometimes 30 years of listening experience with the band with what like bands are doing to really push the envelope today and make albums that are going to be their iconic albums in ways that maybe this one won't be the iconic Pearl Jam album.
Which brings us to, again, a unified selection at number 4. Not a big shock to anybody who has listened to the podcast. We both chose Knocked Loose. You won't go before you're supposed to. I'll go first, and I'll just say that this one you and I have talked about is almost confusing to me, because I do think that it defined the band, and I do think it did something for the genre, but I'm still not quite 100% positive exactly how. But this record, maybe it's just the pure density, the efficiency, that the level of detail in how they pulled off this perfect blend of hardcore with the breaks and the dropouts and the moments. And but man, they created a moment for themselves with this record, and there's just no way that I couldn't have put this in the top 5 somewhere. I love this record so much. It's a quick listen, and I've listened to it dozens and dozens of times this year.
Yeah, we did touch on this a little bit, I think, in last week's episode, it, and it is a groundbreaking hardcore album in the way that it did have some crossover appeal, but at its core, it is hardcore, right? Like, so what makes this exceptional, I think, to me, is how intentional everything feels on this, like how well thought out and planned everything is. The sequencing of these songs, where the breakdowns are in these songs, they really seem to make sure they weren't wasting any space on this album. There's no moments whatsoever in this album where they're just passing the time. Everything feels like it has a purpose and a reason for being where it is. And I think that's what makes, like, it is a perfect album. Like, beginning to end, it is perfect. Like, this is a perfect hardcore album. And I think that's why it stands out so much. So there's lots of hardcore albums that, like, you talk to people and they can immediately point out, like, yeah, this is the moment, this song, that song. But like this one, it really feels like a complete piece from beginning to end that is intended to be listened to that way. It's not about any individual song. It's really about this album as a whole.
Although, if you look at pop culture, it's all about Suffocate.
Sure.
But I'm with you. So I think for fans of the record, people who listen to the entire thing, it's not about one singular song, but it still has that one breakout song, that breakout moment that probably did help launch it to heights further. And it's interesting because you and I have talked at length also about not a hardcore band, but we've talked at length about Def Heaven. And even as perfect as Sunbather is and some of their other records, they probably have never put together as efficient a beginning to end record as what we heard out of Knocked Loose this time. And that's no shade at Def Heaven, who you and I both love basically unconditionally at this point.
Yes.
It's just to remark about the accomplishment that Knocked Loose pulled off this year with this record.
Yeah, I would say, you can think of almost every Def Heaven album. You can think of a moment where it does feel like they're passing the time. And that's just, like I said, there's just no wasted space whatsoever on this Knocked Loose album.
All right, we're still in sync. Number 3, this is a record that you and I talked about before. You're beating me to the punch there, Chief.
That's right.
All Hell by Los Campesinos. And this, I'll let you go first this time.
Sure. And I will mention to people, truly, Craig and I did not coordinate that all these are 4 of our top 5 are the same. And not only are they the same, they ended up in the same order too. And while yes, we did discuss what our top 5 was before this episode, we did these lists independently of each other. And I just think it's funny because I had remarked to Craig that I had a suspicion our number 1 was going to be the same. And I had said to Craig that I didn't think we ever have had the same number 1 before, and how unique this was going to be, that there was an album that we both feel was the number 1. And so it was funny that we ended up with 1, 3, 4, and 5 all in the exact same order. So,
well, and when we're done, by the way, or when we're done with our top 5, I think it would be interesting to somehow we've got to show everybody just how different our 6 through 15 were in selections and order.
Yeah.
Anyway,
definitely.
Go ahead.
But yeah, so with this Los Campesinos album, I would say maybe even some of the same things I said about Vampire Weekend. Like, this does feel a little bit like a career spanning album that does touch on different eras in this band's history. But to be totally honest, and I think I talked about this when we discussed this album originally on the podcast, I had thought that was kind of done with my time as like a hardcore Los Campesinos fan. Like I kind of thought they had run their course and they were probably winding down, and yeah, they might put out a couple more albums and I would listen to them and I would probably like them for a couple listens, and I just didn't expect a Los Campesinos album to still stick with me. Well, not only did this stick with me, I can safely say, I don't know if you agree with this, but I can safely say that this has actually become my favorite Los Campesinos album, which is just ridiculous that this band that's been around, what, 20 years, put out an album that it is just this relevant. And again, like, I would even say some of the same things that I said about Knocked Loose. I don't think this is as perfect from beginning to end, but there's hardly any down moments in this. Like, this is Los Campesinos doing exactly what you want Los Campesinos to do. And again, this is another self-produced album. They made it themselves. They released it themselves. They didn't do it with a record label. And you just get something that at its core is truly, it's Los Campesinos. It's everything they've done well in their career. They found a way to package it and arguably do it better. There's so many of these songs could have been my song of the year, honestly. Like, Feast of Tongues, Coin Op
Psychic Wound.
Guillotine, Psychic Wound. Like, these are songs that in and of themselves are my favorite songs of the year. And it feels weird to even call out a couple songs because I'm leaving out so many other songs that I love on this. But and then even just thematically, the things that they talk about in the lyrics, like, they're sort of like, it's like back to that tongue-in-cheek sort of Los Campesinos way from some of their earlier years that I felt like maybe they had gotten away from a little bit. There's that like edgy sort of snarkiness, the sarcasm to these lyrics, and it gives it that attitude and that punchiness that I had been missing from their last couple albums. So it was just so exciting to me to have a Los Campesinos album that is not just vital and relevant, but my favorite Los Campesinos album.
Yeah, for me, this one probably can't ever surpass Hello Sadness because of the way that one hit me when it hit me, and it was just first. Like, that's the record that caused me to truly, truly fall in love with this band. And so there's no getting around that. I think you mentioned the story, the fact that it was self-produced, that they did it all themselves, they promoted all themselves. I think the story matters in these kinds of things. It affects the way that it affects your headspace when you listen to these things, and as you're taking in the art. And what we hear in this record is not like the desperation of a band without support. We're hearing the freedom, and this is not an efficient record. It's a record that needs to be listened to from beginning to end, but it's got its ups and downs and ins and outs. It's not a quick listen. It's and I don't want to sound trite, but it is kind of a journey from beginning to end. But yet you don't find yourself really falling off from the first half of the record to the second half of the record. You want to finish the whole thing. And so I just think, in terms of an achievement for the band and pushing themselves forward and defining them, even if as a fan, I will always love Hello Sadness the most, I just thought it was really worthy of being celebrated. And honestly, I could have flip-flopped this with Knocked Loose, but it was just, for me, Knocked Loose was more of the new kid on the block in my world. And yeah. There was too much of my heart and soul wrapped up in Los Campesinos that I wanted to put them a little bit higher.
Yeah, and I think for me, the reason I put them higher than Knocked Loose came down to, again, those highs of those songs we mentioned. Those highs are just incredible moments in music that just really, these are songs that were just there for me all year. I never got even remotely sick of those songs. And I just think the highs probably just put it over the edge from Knocked Loose.
All right, buddy. We finally disagree. You're going to do your number 2.
Yeah. Oh, so you beat me to this one. Yeah. Here, my number 2 is Drug Church, Prude. Drug Church is an interesting band to me. They are in the hardcore world, and I think if you listen to them, you would say that that fits to a degree. But like the thing that drew me in originally, the first time I ever heard Drug Church, was, excuse me, hearing some of these elements of almost like 90s like grunge. Like the way the two guitarists in this band play off of each other just feels so much like the way, you know, Jerry Cantrell writes, the way, even though it's way heavier, but like that interplay is kind of similar to me to what Mike and Stone do in Pearl Jam, the way they build these soundscapes off of each other.
I thought of like Sponge and bands like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like anything you could have heard on the radio back in the early mid 90s, you can hear elements of that in Drug Church's music. So I was already like, I had gone back and I was a big fan of theirs. But this album, to me, what really put this over the top and made this my number two album was that they added a melodic quality to this album that wasn't on their previous albums. I mean, like some of these songs, like there's a song 3, which I'm forgetting its title up the top of my head. I'm so bad with song titles these days. It feels like almost like a Gaslight Anthem song in ways. Like, you know, there's just this melodic quality to it that wasn't always there. I think Patrick Kinlan, their vocalist, while he has a interesting vocal style, I think on this album he really pushed the envelope as best he could to try to add more melody into what he was delivering. And again, the guitars are just unbelievable, and this album just sounds good. The mix is great. Like I love the way this album sounds. It does enough, like for me, it pulls enough from the hardcore world, which you know I love, and it pulled enough from the 90s era style, that grunge quality that I love, and it sort of mixed it together in such a perfect way. And I really, if any album threatened my number one, I had about a 1 week period, and I think I even told you at the time, I'm not sure that Drug Church isn't going to be my favorite album of the year. It got real close at one point. So for all those reasons, this was just an easy number two for me.
It's interesting. I'm not going to criticize your number two because I think it's a great record too. But for me, I just felt like it was a continue. I loved Drug Church's last record. The name escapes me, but I loved it and I listened to it so much. And I felt like this was an awesome continuation, maybe even a slight step forward. But I thought it didn't feel like the big giant leap forward, even as awesome as it is and as much as I love it.
I think that's fair. I think the melodic elements I'm talking about are subtle. You're not going to listen to this and be like, holy shit, they went from a purely rhythmic band to a purely melodic band. I think as somebody who's really gone in the bag for them, I just noticed those subtle elements that to me elevated this and makes this, again, my favorite Drug Church album.
All right, which brings us to my number two, and you're not gonna be able to do the
I can't hold
album
up
cover.
I can't hold up my vinyl for this one.
No. And this one made a lot of lists. It's Manning Fireworks by MJ Lenderman. And I'm even a little bit surprised how much I ended up loving this record. Over time, I guess I found myself more and more in this category listening to this type of music. But anybody who knows me knows that goofy lyrics and like more lighthearted type stuff is usually not my cup of tea. I usually hate it. That's not why I like music. I like music for emotion. I'm like an emo kid. I'm a metal kid. Not a kid at all anymore, but those are the kinds of music that I gravitate toward. And this record has a lot of goofy lyrics, goofy quotable lyrics that are kind of fun. It's a little bit, mid to slow tempo. I think Stephen Haydn would call it patio music. But ultimately what it came down to is it's a quick record. It's 9 songs. It's one of the most listenable first 5. It goes from Manning Fireworks to Joker Lips to Rudolph to Wristwatch to maybe my favorite song of the year, She's Leaving You. And it's just absolutely unbelievable songwriting. And he pulls it off. in a way that I think the surprise factor of how much I ended up loving this is maybe part of the reason why it ended up being number 2 for me. But I honestly thought a couple of times about flip flopping this with my number 1 as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I am not normally predisposed to liking this kind of album. So I don't think it's a surprise that I didn't rank it very high on my list, but it did make my list. And it's the first MJ Lenderman album to make my list. She's Leaving You was definitely a standout moment for me when I listened to this album. That was the one that really caught my attention, made me perk up and say, "Oh, what's going on here?" I have nothing bad to say about this album. It's just not my wheelhouse. I never expected to love this album, and it's just a personal taste thing for me. But like I said, like I think just the fact that it even made my list when nothing he's done before has ever made my list kind of speaks volumes, I think, to the quality of this album as a complete work.
Yeah. All right, which brings us to the number 1, which is not going to surprise anybody at all. We have Foxing by Foxing. You and I could not stop raving about this record. We did an entire episode on it where we went track by track by track. So honestly, we don't have to go too far, but I think it's important maybe just to talk about it in the realm of why we selected this, why you selected this, and I independently also selected it above all the rest. And I'll go very quickly and just say that this one did redefine a band and probably defined a band. Well, redefined a band because they already had one kind of peak in their career. Peak isn't fair, but they already had one explosion in their career. And this one, I don't know if it is an explosion or not, but it should be.
Yeah, I mean, you could arguably say they had already even had two peaks, really, to a degree. Like the Albatross was such a hit in the emo world, that's their debut album that, you know, that sort of became, a big thing in that universe. And then obviously Nearer My God comes out. And again, so that was like the first time they redefined themselves in a way that I think blew everybody away who was familiar with boxing. It was an entirely new direction for them. And I think what's interesting is, when Draw Down the Moon comes out, it wasn't well received by a decent number of their fan base. That's just the fact. A lot of people checked out on Foxing after Draw Down the Moon, an album you and I both like, but
It
I
was their
can
first real foray into art rock.
right. And I think that's what kind of turned people off to it to some degree. I think they had stripped away a lot of the emo elements by that point. And I think a lot of people just said, you know what, they're on a path that I'm just not here for. And, we talked last week when we did our Vitology episode and we talked about like the ways Pearl Jam between Vitology and No Code kind of like went about defining their relationship with their fans. They kind of got to the point where they just wanted the people who were going to be along for the journey and in the bag for them, so to speak. And to some degree I think that's what they did with Draw Down the Moon. I think the fans they have today are the people who were willing to say, you know what, even if, and there are people who Draw Down the Moon is their favorite Foxing album, but even if it's not your favorite Foxing album, I think if you're still along for the journey, you were willing to say like, I hear what they were doing in this and I appreciate it. And and I still listen to that album and I still enjoy it. But this self-titled album is a pushing of the envelope, like you said, a redefining of a band. This shook the entire foundation of what we thought about Foxing and what they could be and what they're capable of. And what I don't want to say it's a complaint, but one of the things that observations that you and I frequently made about Foxing was that we always felt like their albums didn't quite capture the dynamic of their live show. And this album to me absolutely does. This hits you in the same way seeing Foxing live hits you. And from the so when they released Greyhound, which is a 9-minute lead single, I really liked that song. And well, not just liked, I loved that song. I couldn't stop listening to it. but I didn't prepare me yet for what this album was going to be. And for me, it was the first time I hit play on Hell 99. And it was just, again, it just shook me to my core. It just like reframed everything I had been thinking that Foxing was as a band and what they could be. And I was so excited to see what they were going to do with this album. And my expectations for this were unfairly high. And it met those expectations. And in many ways, even exceeded it. Like, as much as I love Hell 99, this is not a beginning to end screamo album. Like, this is probably, in my opinion, the most Foxing album that there is. Like, to me, this just hits everything that they're capable of, everything I want out of them, everything I hoped they could be. And like, just, I mean, this is an hour-long album. It's not a quick listen. It's not light listening. You really have to give it multiple listens to totally grasp everything that they're doing in all these songs and the different turns that they take, the way some of these songs build and become different songs by the end from what they started. And just as I just listen to this, time after time after time, I just never got tired of it. Like, there's so many times I had to stop myself from listening to it again because I'm like, I don't want to wear this album out on me. I don't want to, get tired of this album. And so I just think, from what I want in a number one album of the year, an album that really steps forward. It's a statement album. It has something important to say about the band, how they view themselves, how they think about their place in the music industry today, their place in society today, all these things. I love this album, and there was just no doubt that this was going to be my number one album of the year.
So the interesting thing was last week when I was listening to IndieCast and Stephen Hyden and Ian Cohen did their top 5 lists. This ended up being number 1 for Ian Cohen. And then he talked a little bit about how the Metacritic score is his own review. The album he put number 1 for the year, his own review was actually dragging down the Metacritic score for this record. And they kind of joked a little bit back and forth about it. And Ian kind of quipped, yeah, because I did it for Pitchfork. And so in Pitchfork, he wrote this review and it ended up scoring a 7.8. And so that means to me, that answer, obviously Ian doesn't get to just drop whatever score he wants on whatever he puts out there. So he writes the review, he does all the critical work and puts all the words together. And then they must have a committee of sorts arriving at what the actual number is.
Yeah, I think, didn't Ian also had Los Campesinos and Knocked Loose, I think, in his top 5 as well. So,
and Hyden had Lenderman in there.
MJ.
You can tell we're in the same ballpark. We're 40-something men, white men.
That's right.
In the world. Right. Which, by the way, so we have a bunch of categories we want to talk about and some other things. But one of the things that occurred to me, a lot of the conversation I've heard around specifically MJ Lenderman is that, like, it's kind of a dude's rock. People are concerned about what the messaging is of having all men or a bunch of men dominating year-end best of lists. Now, first of all, you and I, our list this year is completely and utterly dominated by men. And this podcast hasn't been around long enough for people to know that, like, that's not our track record at all. But so number one, I will say last year, our top 10 and maybe our top 5 was dominated by Bully and Blonde Shell and some other records like that. Waxahachie made my top 10 this year.
Filth is Eternal was my number 1 last year, which is a female-led band.
Yeah, and so I don't want to be like, hey, I've got lots of friends who are girls. I don't want to do like that defense of us. But even more so, is it just like natural ups and downs? Is it just, whatever kind of accidental cycle because I think you and I are very open to it. I just didn't feel like there was anything. I feel like I wasn't sending a message by setting up my top 10 the way I did.
It's funny because I'm sitting here looking at my extended list right now, and I'm like looking and like,
See You Space Cowboy.
Wishy has a female who sometimes sings lead. You got to get down to 26, Gouge Away.
I think there's a female member in Stay Inside.
Stay Inside.
But anyway, the point being, I don't want to go through and count the females, I guess.
Yeah. We
But
got
I mean,
binders. We got binders full of women, Craig.
God.
Binders full of women.
No, but honestly, I mean, do you think there's anything to it, or is it just whatever, kind of accidental?
I think it's totally accidental. I think it was just the music that hit me this year. Like, I am a sucker for aggressive music with female vocalists. Like, I'm a huge sucker for it. So I just didn't come across a lot of it that, really stuck with me. Like, even, Mannequin Pussy, which is an album that a lot of critics absolutely love, and it has made a lot of year-end top lists. I had it at 31 on my list.
So that was an oversight on my part. It wouldn't have made my top 5. It wouldn't have made my top 10, but it should have been in my top 15.
Yeah. So, but, it was just, I don't feel like I was discarding any female fronted music this year. Like, even like, I don't get into the pop stuff as much. So Charlie XCX isn't going to do much for me. I like Sabrina Carpenter. I like kind of what she stands for, but that album's not going to make my list. And even Taylor Swift, I found Tortured Poets Department to be a bit of a chore to get
It
through.
was a slog.
Yeah, it was so long, and so
and I loved her 2 indie rock records. I liked some of her pop stuff. I've seen her live on the 1989 tour. I will admit when Taylor Swift does something really awesome. I don't think her new double album is particularly great.
Yeah. So for me, it's just kind of the way it shook out. I fully expect next year we'll see some good, for me, some good aggressive hardcore music fronted by females. So
yeah, I mean, if we get another Blonde Shell, another Bully, any of those,
absolutely. I think Brutus is kind of winding down for a while. They've been putting out in their email newsletters. I think they've been so busy touring that I think they're kind of ready for a little bit of a break. But, I promise you, next time Brutus puts out an album, you and I are going to have it pretty high on our list. I'd be shocked if it didn't.
Well, and if I get a new Churches record, I think I see on Instagram that Now is in the studio. I love that work, and so that I think it's just the normal ups and down cycles. All right, so you and I had some categories that might only be important to us, but we decided to go with it. So number 1, out of all the things you listen to, we're looking for the best album closing track.
So I think if there's a decent chance my true number 1 would be what you're going to talk about, and I'll let you talk about that one as the album closer. I also have to give honorable mention to Drug Church's Peer Review. God, like every time I listen to that song, it's so hard to not just start the album over again, which is always like, one of the defining qualities that we talk about in a great album closing track. But the one I picked is State Fault's Bodega Head. This is, like, to me, a great closing track doesn't have to sound like everything else on the album. Like, one of my all-time favorite closing tracks is the one on that Ithaca album. That sounds absolutely nothing like anything else on the album. Same thing with Soul Glow, their last album, Diaspora Problem. Like, that closing track doesn't sound like really anything else on that album. But Bodega Head, it does get there. Like, it does get to the point where it sounds like other stuff, but it just, after this album just beats you over the head with just aggressive screamo music for like an hour and a half, like this, I mean, I'm probably exaggerating, but this is a long album, which is surprising in and of itself for this style of music. Bodega Head just ends with this just nice, like, subtle guitar riff and just a beautiful vocal melody. And it just slowly builds and builds and builds. And eventually it does kick in. And then they do the thing where they pull it back in. It's just really just a great album closer.
Yeah, and it's a great album, by the way. It's one that could have hit a different category, albums that I forgot about, but I remembered it just in time so that it didn't make the forgotten albums list. I found out today while I was reading an article that it was produced by somebody from The World Is a Beautiful Place, who's another one of my absolute favorite bands. So yeah, I mean, this one continues to bring layers. It's a super long record. It's like if you took the aggressiveness of Knocked Loose, but the sprawling nature of Los Campesinos, and you
Yeah.
plopped them on a record, it would be the State Faults record. But there's
Yeah.
a shocking amount of melody in the State Faults
Oh
record
yeah.
where
Oh yes.
the like open a verse just screaming, 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 and then maybe the second or third time they hit the verse, they find a vocal melody that just blows your mind.
Yeah. And sometimes they do it
So
with the guitar too. Like just like
yeah,
these crushing guitar riffs, and then all of a sudden they switch over to some kind of a lead part that provides the melody. It's just really well done album.
yeah, absolutely. So my best album closing track, I went back to Pearl Jam, Setting Sun. It was not only the best closing song on a record I heard this year. It served that purpose more often than not on the tour, either at the end of the main set or at the end of the encores. It's just a beautiful song, one that is classic Pearl Jam album ender. They've done it so many times, and I'm guessing that it was an intentional choice to try and do it again.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, whether it's intentional or not, I don't know. But the again, similarly to Bodega Head, like it's a song that starts one way and kind of builds and builds, and then like really hits that change, right through the ending part. And again, like it's hard to separate out the feeling of experiencing this song live too. Like it didn't close the show I went to, but it to me it still felt like the closer, because I think after that they just did Bob O'Reilly and Yellow Ledbetter, and like to me, like they've played those songs so many times that doesn't even count as the close. Like this was the true closing track to that
Yeah.
show for me.
All right, that brings us to underrated or forgotten album of the year. Did you go with an underrated or a forgotten?
So I went with underrated. I will say, if I'm gonna say forgotten, for me it's actually that Price Horse album, Undersound, that came out in like January or February, and it was a really, really good album that I really liked at that time, and I don't think I've listened to it in the last 7 months. And so that one is the forgotten one for me. But my underrated album is Thou, their album Umbilical. It should be higher. It should be a top 10 album in my list. I had it there originally, and then I moved it out, and it's just one that I feel like should have been a lot higher. I really, really loved that album.
So we're going to jump around a little bit because for me, that was the genre bending album. I
I
know
was
it's
so
kind of
mad
a,
when I saw you picked that, because I was like, God, that's such a good pick. I wish I would have thought of. I don't know how I didn't think
yeah,
of it for that category.
it's kind of a doomy, heavy, grinding type of an album. But one of the things that you and I love about it, and something that you and I talked about, is just how much the music itself sounds like these alternative rock. And so you've got this like almost interpolation of 90s grunge into what would you call it, like doom metal or
Yeah,
hardcore,
doom.
like
I would definitely call it doom metal. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's gloomy metal, but just if anybody who's willing to truly listen hard is going to hear all their favorite these grunge superheroes in the
yeah,
background
and they're
without
they're
sounding like it's aping it.
yeah, no, like thou are unabashed 90s grunge fanatics. They talk about it a lot. They've done cover albums. They've done an entire Nirvana cover album. Like these guys love 90s music. They're not afraid to wear that on their sleeves. I just thought that this album, they really like all of their other albums are very esoteric. Like you have to maybe even swamp metal would be a good
Yeah.
terminology for it. This album to me is their most approachable album. Again, I wouldn't give it to somebody who's like, oh, I like Taylor Swift and Post Malone. Like, oh, you should check out Thou. Like, it's not that kind of approachable.
No.
But if you're into heavy music, I think it's their most approachable album.
All right. And so we're still talking about underrated or forgotten album, and I'm going to pull a fast one on you, and I'm going to make you talk about my pick, See You Space Cowboy,
Yeah.
cuz that was my Like, you found it and you told me to listen to it, and I did, and I was like shocked how great it is, but how inventive and crazy it is. But I know for a fact that you can talk better about it than I can. So I'm actually going to make you talk about my pick.
Yeah, and that's fine because this was my genre bending pick.
That
Because,
works out perfectly.
yeah, because so they call themselves a sasscore band. You know, again, this is another like all these subgenres of what I'll call heavier aggressive music are a little bit funny. Like, you know,
So Wikipedia, they list the genres as metalcore, post-hardcore, and punk rock.
yeah, and it's like, and then they define themselves as sasscore, but
Okay.
they do pull like these elements of all those genres that you just mentioned. Like there is hardcore in it, there is post-hardcore, there is punk in it, there is metal in it. To me, this is
And I
one
think it
of
was
the
the really clean compressed metal that really shocked me the most.
yeah, and that's where to me this is one of the catchiest albums of this genre.
Yes.
Like it is super catchy. Like I know how much Craig always talks about how much he needs hooks in the music, and this one delivers the hooks for sure. You know, from beginning to end. It is a very aggressive album though, but there's just something infectious about this band, and I just think they're one of the coolest sounding bands. Like they just have like I even really hear like a lot of like the used, you know, like going back to some of like
Wow.
maybe even like their second album. I can't remember what the second album was called off the top of my head. Maybe Memories or something like that. But
Yeah.
I hear a lot of elements of that in this combined with like their hardcore. Like they've come up in the hardcore scene. So
And
like
they're on
that's
Pure Noise Records. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, this one just came out of nowhere for me this year, and I really love that album. And it probably could be underrated for me too. Like again, this is when we talked about albums that in other years would this one would be contending for top 5 in like almost any other year. But uh yeah, it's just really good.
All right, that brings us to the surprise of the year, and I'm just going to say Dark Matter. That's my surprise of the year. I don't need to say another word about Dark Matter.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also have had Foxing as a surprise of the year. I just didn't expect this album from them. Another surprise
Honestly,
of the year.
almost all the top 5 are going to be
Yeah,
surprising.
that is true. Another one I put was Fucked Up's Time and a Half. Who's Got the Time and a Half? This was the album that
Every
they.
single time we do a podcast, you force it explicit.
I
It's
know,
just
I know,
these
I
band
know.
names. What are you doing to us?
It's not my fault. I didn't name the band. No, but this was the album that they wrote and recorded in 24 hours and live streamed themselves. So like, it's not my favorite album of the year. They put out 3 albums this year. It's number 3 of their albums for me, but it's the most surprising because I still can't believe they actually pulled it off and that it's a very good listenable album. Like it's not a pile of shit. Like it is a pretty solid like it's a pretty solid album. Like it's rough around the edges. It sounds incomplete because it has to when when you record and produce and mix that fast, but I just found it surprising that they pulled it off. I still can't believe they pulled it off.
Yeah. All right, comeback album of the year for me. I picked the Smashing Pumpkins, Agori Mori May. I think I enjoyed this one more than you did this year, but I was just so in awe, not in awe. I was so in love with the fact that it sounded like an actual Pumpkins record, and the songs they were digestible. I was going to say they're bite sized, but some of them are actually kind of long. I just felt like by seeding and going backwards and seeding himself to song structure again with choruses and verses, it just made my Pumpkins experience a whole lot better this year. I don't think it's a perfect album, and I think it falls off a little bit towards the end. It gets a little bit spotty in the second half, but I think the first 4 or 5, I think that it's as strong as any Pumpkins material since I don't know when. What's the record that he refuses to put out anymore that you and I still love?
Zeitgeist.
Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Love that record. It's probably my
Absolutely.
favorite thing since Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this is like Machina Zeitgeist era Pumpkins, and I'm
Sure.
here for it. I love it.
So it got honorable mention. I put this as my number 2 comeback album of the year. And you're right in that I don't like it near as much as you do. It didn't sniff my top 25, like it wasn't even close. But
what a track.
yeah, but for me, for all the things you just said, I'm not going to reiterate it. I'll just say I pretty much agreed with all your points about why it was a comeback album. I just picked Los Campesinos because, again, like I mentioned when I talked about it at the top of the show, I thought I was done with them as being like a band that I like really cared about new albums from. I just didn't expect to get my favorite Los Campesinos album. So
And I'm smiling and half laughing because it wasn't a comeback record for me, man. I've loved everything since Hello Sadness. So I never quite jumped off to the same degree. But
yeah,
that's what's cool about the places where you and I do tend to diverge from time to time. It's like even when we're in on the same artist, there's these small divergences, different records, different songs, and I that's one of my favorite parts about doing this podcast. And before we did the podcast, chatting on Discord about music
that's
all the
right.
time.
That's right.
All right, so I'm gonna let you go first with collaboration of the year because I don't think you're gonna pick mine.
I'm definitely not. I admittedly, as I was thinking about this category, I was like, I didn't really listen to a lot of music that had a lot of collaborations. Like I could have just said, "Oh, fine, I'll just go with Suffocate." Knock Loose
And
and
I forced
Poppy.
you to put this category in. This wasn't on
Yeah,
your original list of categories.
yeah. But I did pick what's at one of my absolute favorite songs of the year. Not we're gonna get to song of the year, but not my not my absolute favorite song of the year, but it's probably in the top 5, and that's Zach Bryan, "Pink Skies," the song he did with Watch House. I couldn't tell you anything about Watch House. Don't know who they are. I read a little bit about them on Wikipedia, but I'm not familiar with their work at all. But that song is just so damn good that I was just like, all right, well, that's just a no-brainer for me.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess this works out well because we're going to do two at once. My collaboration of the year is also the song of the year. So I'll just do this now and then you could do your song of the year. And that's the combination, the Waxahachie and Lenderman song, Right Back to It. This was probably also, and it's not fair maybe, but this probably also leaked into my overall feelings about MJ Lenderman this year because this song, Right Back to It, it came out relatively early in the year, I believe, and the harmonies are just perfect. It's wonderful songwriting. And it made me love the Waxahachie record. A Waxahachie record, by the way, that other people are saying, well, it's not really as good as the last one that they/she put out. But for me, I thought it was a phenomenal record. It was definitely in my top 10. It was in my top 10 from Tiger's Blood. And a lot of the reason why is this beautiful harmony between her and MJ Lenderman. And it's also my favorite song of the year.
So I don't have much to add to that. Waxahachie is not really for me, so I won't really.
Which is fair. Like
Which
I love it, but I also, a lot of the things that you and I love, we also understand why other people might not love them.
That's right. That's very true. But in this case, like everybody loves Waxahachie. I'm the one that's clearly
The turd in the
wrong
punch
about
bowl.
this. Yeah, indeed. So I'm gonna cheat again and give honorable mention to a couple songs because I have to mention Drug Church's "Business Ethics," which I think is just perfection. I think it is a perfect punk/hardcore song. Lyrically, thematically, just the way they layered the guitar parts in this, like I loved everything about that song. So I had to give an honorable mention to that. I also had to give honorable mention to Vampire Weekend's Gen X Cops, which I mean, I heard that song early in the year and I just haven't stopped loving this song. Like it's my favorite part when I get to it on their album Only God Was Above Us. Absolutely love that song. But for me, my song of the year, I've been saying it's my theme for this entire year. It's Foxing's Hell 99. It's one of those things like, is it like musically my favorite song on the album? Maybe not. Like
Yeah.
it's hard to compete even with Greyhound or Gratitude, Hall of Frozen Heads, Dead Internet. Like there's just so many killer songs on this Foxing album. But for me, like the feeling, emotions that I get listening to Hell 99 just sums up everything I feel about just everything in this year. Like this year has just been a Hell 99 year for me. And I just it's thematically, it's my motto, my personal motto for the year. I've just loved this song. So for me, that it had to be my song of the year.
Yeah, I certainly could have chosen that one as well. I love that song. I could have chosen 3, 4 from that record, Foxing. I was trying to think of the record name, and it's very easy. It's self-titled, Foxing, Foxing. Another one that I just have to mention, and it's one that you and I have talked a lot about because of the weirdness of liking Zach Bryan.
Yeah.
It's just, for me, it feels like a weird thing to like, and I didn't really like him or know about him until you really pushed me to dive in. And then I heard the song 28 this year.
Yeah.
It has completely blown up. It is
Yeah.
all over everywhere. I would say of all the songs I loved this year, that is maybe the most well known universally in a country that no longer has a monoculture.
Yeah.
But 28 is just an achievement, and it doesn't do anything that hasn't been done before, but it just does it so well.
If Zach Bryan had an editor, a producer who said, hey, let's cut some of these songs out of here, I think Great American Bar Scene could have easily been a top 5 album for me. The reason it didn't, it finished at number 10 for me. And the reason it didn't finish higher than that is because there are so many songs that I feel like were just thrown in there. And again, when we talk about collaborations, like the Bruce Springsteen collaboration doesn't really work for me very much on that one. Although the John Mayer one is actually better than I expected it to be. It's a weird collaboration. But anyways, between 28, Oak Island, like I said, Pink Skies, Purple Gas, like this album had some really high highs, some like real peaks on that album. And obviously, I mean, everything you said about Zach Bryan being weird that we like applies to me as well. Like, I don't listen to anything else like Zach
When
Bryan.
it's all your fault because you pulled me in.
Yeah, ever since his self-titled album, the first time I heard it, just something about it just really resonated with me. Just really drew me in a way I don't listen to very much country music, and at this point, like, I guess Great American Bar Scene is still a country album, but I mean, when you talk about genre bending, this could have been a genre bending album too, because it's really leaning into more of the alt rock, Americana,
Yeah.
like,
And really, what's the difference between country and Americana? Jason Isbell's been bending that line for years and years.
I was just gonna say, you're hearing the Jason Isbell influence on Zach Bryan on this album for sure. So, and I think
And they played some shows together, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think he's probably going to continue going in that direction. Although I don't know, maybe he's going to stop making music for a while because apparently he's going to France to go to grad school. So,
well, he can do whatever he wants now. He's been so successful and so phenomenal as an artist and songwriter, and prolific too. Holy hell.
Yeah,
the guy puts out a new song every week, it feels like.
Yep.
All right, the last category. That doesn't mean we're done talking though, because I've got a couple other things that I'm just going to make us talk about. I always say I'm going to make you talk about, but I'm going to talk about it too. So, live show of the year, and I'm going to go first on this one. I go to a lot of live shows, and I could have picked any number of different things. I think I saw I think it was still 2024 when I saw Thursday do the anniversary show for their record at the Beachland Ballroom, and that was like an absolute highlight.
I forgot about that show. Yeah.
An absolute highlight of the year. I went to Boston. I saw Manchester Orchestra. I saw Pearl Jam twice at Fenway. But this is going to shock some people. But here's the answer. The Wax Bodega Tour, featuring Arm's Length, Saturdays at Your Place, Ben Quad, and Carly Cosgrove. I went into that show wanting to see Saturdays at Your Place the most. They played first and only played for about 25 minutes. But then I was continually just brought in by Carly Cosgrove, Ben Quad, and then Arm's Length is just, they are a better live band than they are an albums band or even musicians. And I hope that isn't too insulting, because I think it just speaks to their it helps when you're playing to an emo audience where everybody knows the words to every song. I only know about 60 or 70% of the words to the songs, but just the most fun I had all year, the most packed bill. I think I went for $30, give or take, and all things in, man, just beautiful and perfect. And by the way, last thing, there's a relatively new venue. It's only been open a year and a half, called the Roxy in Cleveland, and just planned to perfection. Sound is great, all the logistics, there's not a bad sight line, stage is the right height, the lights are good. It's like, they took a box, a big room, and they created one of the most influential concert spaces in all of Cleveland, which is, well, technically Lakewood, sorry. But anyway, all right,
Yeah.
live show of the year, Andrew.
That may surprise other people. It does not surprise me that you picked that, because you didn't stop talking about that show for a good week or two after it, and you've continued to bring it up throughout the year. So I know how much you loved that show. I don't go to near as many live shows as you do. So I thought about like changing this for myself and making it a show I regret not going to the most. Foxing.
Mine's Los Campesinos. So
I had opportunity to see Foxing, Knocked Loose, and Drug Church, and I didn't go to any of those shows.
not on the same bill, separate
Not
nights.
on the same bill, all separate shows.
You would have gone if they'd all been on the same bill.
The Knocked Loose one, I balked at the price, which is a dumb reason to not go. The Foxing one, I was out of town that weekend, and I had gotten back into town like an hour before they were supposed to go. So I literally would have had to have dropped all my stuff off, gone down to campus, and gone to that show. And I still wish I would have. But I just couldn't do it. But anyways, I will say though, big shocker. My favorite live show of the year that I went to is Pearl Jam. I mean, it was my first time seeing them in so long, and I think it was something like 13 years since I had last seen them. So going on that long of a break, man, maybe it wasn't quite that long. What? I think it was 10 years. I think 2014 was maybe the last time I saw them. So 10 years. Anyways, just getting to go and see them again and see them do this album that means so much to me. It's, for me, that one's got to be my pick.
All right. So I'm glancing down the rest of our lists from 6 to 25 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
We can't hit them all. And we've talked about a bunch of things like Zach Bryan and See You Space Cowboy and Thou. But maybe pick 2 or 3 that you think are notable in that didn't make the top 5 that we should talk about.
Yeah, I'm going to let you talk about Infant Island since you're the one who brought them to my attention, and I think it's important that we do talk about them, but I'll let you talk about them. I'll mention the
I'm actually going to disagree with that, because I did bring it to your attention, but you dove in heavier. You have to talk about that one. I've got my own that I can talk about.
Okay. Well, I do first want to talk about the Dive album, Frog and Boiling Water.
That's D-I-I-V, all capital letters.
Yes. You want to pronounce it Div, because it looks like it should be Div, but they changed their name from Dive to this spelling because there was another band called Dive. Anyways, Frog in the Boiling Water, I could have put this on a genre bending one too, because at its core, it's shoegaze. Like, I'm pretty sure most people would listen to it and say it's a shoegaze album, but it's kind of also not really shoegaze in the same way that like traditional shoegaze is. There's a sort of like just a earthiness that elevates it above what I view as like your traditional shoegaze. It does a few things that I think are more interesting rhythmically and even musically or sonically. But so that one was a standout album for me that I really loved. I also got to mention Chat Pile, Cool World. This thing is a monster. This album is so heavy and insightful and interesting and at times scary. There's like a scary quality to Chat Pile. They pull all kinds of influences across the board. There is nobody that sounds like Chat Pile. Like in the world of heavy music, there's just nobody that sounds like Chat Pile, and I really love that album. And then, yeah, as for Infant Island, their album Obsidian Wreath, this is a sort of in the way like you would call Death Heaven a black metal band. Like, I suppose you would say this is a black metal album, but like, in the same way Death Heaven transcends it, well, not in the same way, but in a different way, Infant Island does also transcend outside of just that black metal box. But they have the blast beats and the big walls of guitars, like all that stuff is there. But this album is just so lush. It sounds so alive. And it's an album that I'm sure on this podcast at some point I said, well, this is obviously going to be a top 5 album of the year for me. It ended up at number 9 on my list, but it's, again, I know I'm a broken record on this, but any other year, this could have been a top 5 album for sure.
Yeah, it ended up being in my top 10 as well. Just love this record so much. It was, and it's cheap to say it, but it's the Death Heaven record we didn't get for me. Like, it filled that hole, is that
correct.
void for me.
That's a great way to put it.
So,
which we need to do. We need to do an episode sometime about how we feel about Infinite Granite now.
Yeah.
Now that a couple of years have passed, but that's not we can't even begin to touch that today. So.
No, but we are gonna have to do that.
Yeah.
A couple of records I wanted to bring up, and it's interesting because you really forced me to dig into this one, and then I went and saw Wild Pink live.
Yeah.
Dulling the Horns a little bit late in the year, so I think maybe if I'd had a good 6 or 7 months with this record before the year-end list came out, it might have been higher. It might have, I don't know if it would have challenged for the top 5, but certainly ended up number 6 for me. And maybe that's even overrating it a little bit, but it just, that live show really cemented this record and gave new color to the songs in ways that I didn't think a band like this, that's a little bit on the understated side, would be able to do for me.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think if this had come out early in the year and I had more time with it, and maybe if it would have come out in a less loaded era, like where there were so many other things I was listening to, it could have ended up being a lot higher for me. This is a really, really strong album from Wild Pink.
Yeah, a very, very personal pick for me that I just wanted to give them a shout out because, there's certain bands that you and I will listen to that have tiny amounts of streams and tiny amounts of followers on Spotify, but for whatever reason they hit your radar, my radar, and we end up falling in love with these bands as if they're filling stadiums. And one of those bands for me is it's an emo band called Southtown Lanes, and the record is called Take Care. And man, something about the way the tone of the vocals and the song structures, it's got a great album ender too. I really ended up loving this record, listening to it a ton. And they're maybe the least listened to, like, streaming wise, out of all the things that I put on my list this year. So I always feel like bands like that deserve an extra special shout out.
Yeah, no, that's a good pick. And similarly, if I'll give probably my one that has to have the least amount of streams, is the Cosmic Joke album, self-titled. The Hard Lore podcast started up a record label this year, and this was the first thing they put out on it. And it's just a really great punk album. Like, it's more punk than hardcore, but it's like 20 minutes long. It's a real quick listen, but if you just love classic old school punk, like, you will like this Cosmic Joke album.
All right, one other, go ahead.
I feel like we should also just at least mention Cloud Nothings.
That was where I was going next. You stole my thunder.
All right, well, you set it up.
Yeah, a band that you and I love, just absolutely unequivocally, and they put out a phenomenal record this year. A lot, Ian Cohen and Stephen Hayden joked on their podcast that it's the return to form. They always kind of joke about those critical tropes. But truly, like, I've never fallen off with Cloud Nothings. I think maybe they fall into that category of being a little bit too prolific at times. But Final Summer is just a killer record.
Yeah, I can't understand why I didn't rank it higher than I did. I don't have a good explanation for it. I think maybe there were just things that were a little bit more exciting, kind of like what you talked about to lead off this podcast, bands who maybe push the envelope in a way that this one doesn't for Cloud Nothings. This is not their groundbreaking album. This isn't the Attack on Memory or, Here or Nowhere Else. This is just, to me, this is just Cloud Nothings really settling into a mature side. Like, it's weird to think that they've been around long enough but they have been. Like, they're kind of a mature band at this point. And I think it was exciting to hear what a really good, aggressive, mature sounding Cloud Nothings can sound like. And, this is an album I listened to, and it probably deserves to be higher than it. I had it number 15 on my list. Like, it deserves to be higher than that. You and I both, we adore this band, and I can't go a year-end thing without talking about Cloud Nothings. One of my absolute favorite bands in the world.
And with that, is there any place else you need to go? Because I think I covered it.
Yeah, I think the only place I need to go is to go get a cough drop and let my voice recover. So
yeah, we've also never taken a pee break on this podcast, but if we went for another 10 minutes, I might need to take one. No, this has been awesome. It was a great year of music. Our corner of the world, as always, our corner of the world is going to be different than yours. And we're not telling you that these are the 5 best or 10 best. Unequivocally, we're saying that they're our favorites more than anything else. So regardless of what the title of the podcast is for the algorithms, these are just our favorite records of the year, and we're not besmirching your favorite records of the year.
And please, if you're still listening to this, whatever platform you're listening on, drop a comment and tell us a couple of your favorite albums of the year. I love hearing what other people listen to.
We'll check it out.
I rarely beg for comments or anything like that, but I would really love to hear some feedback on what's the music that stood out to you guys this year. What did you love? And like Greg said, I want to listen to it. I want to check it out. Do you agree with some of ours? Do you disagree with some of ours?
Everybody who made it to this point, you owe us your top 5. We will hear no excuses. You will drop it in a comment on some social media platform or YouTube. Thank you.
That's right. There we go.
All right. And that's it. We appreciate you guys very much. Please do all the nice things for us. Share it with a friend. It's the Album of Record podcast.